Glorfindel, the true hero behind Rivendell. The hero the movies couldn't explain. In Peter Jackson's cinematic adaptation of The Fellowship of the Ring, the character of Glorfindel was entirely replaced by Arwen Undomiel during the high-stakes flight to the Ford of Bruinen. While this decision was pragmatically driven by the need to consolidate the cast and establish Arwen's romantic and heroic stakes early on, it fundamentally altered the spiritual weight of the scene. In the films, the rescue is a frantic chase. In the books, it is a confrontation of metaphysical authorities. By removing the golden-haired elf lord, the movies traded a profound display of ancient celestial power for a more conventional action sequence, leaving general audiences unaware of the most formidable warrior residing within Rivendell's borders. The erasure of Glorfindel matters because it obscures Tolkien's core concept of the seen and unseen worlds. When the Nazgûl encounter Arwen in the film, they see a defiant rebel. When they encounter Glorfindel in the text, they see a figure of white fire that exists simultaneously in the physical and spiritual realms. Glorfindel is a Cullaquendi, a high elf who has lived in the light of the two trees of Valinor, and his presence acts as a spiritual radioactive source that the shadow-dwelling ringwraiths cannot endure. Without him, the narrative loses the critical realization that the Nazgûl are not just afraid of swords, but are utterly repulsed by the inherent sanctity and re-embodied light of a being who has already conquered death. Finally, removing Glorfindel simplifies the power hierarchy of Middle-earth to a degree that hides the complexity of Tolkien's world-building. Glorfindel represents a unique third tier of power, beings who are not gods, Valar, or angels, Maiar, but possess a status nearly equal to them through sacrifice and divine grace. His absence makes the world feel smaller and less ancient, as he is the primary link between the First Age's cataclysmic wars and the Third Age's desperate struggle. By losing Glorfindel, we lose the Guardian, whose mere existence provided a spiritual shield over Rivendell, making it the only place where the ring-bearer could truly find a moment of sanctuary against the encroaching unseen world. The hidden world the movies never showed. In Tolkien's cosmology, the world of Middle-earth is not merely physical. It is a dual-layered reality, consisting of the seen, the material world, and the unseen, the spiritual or wraith world. Most living beings, including men and even many elves of the Third Age, exist primarily in the seen, their spirits tethered firmly to their physical forms. However, the Nazgûl, having been consumed by their rings of power, are permanently stranded in the unseen, appearing as invisible shadows to the naked eye. When Frodo puts on the One Ring, he's forcibly shifted into this spiritual dimension, which is why the physical world blurs into a gray mist, while the true, terrifying nature of the ringwraiths is revealed to him as haggard kings with pale faces and burning eyes. Glorfindel stands as a radiant anomaly within this structure because he's a Cullaquendi, or an elf of the light. Unlike the Dark Elves who never left Middle-earth, Glorfindel dwelt in Valinor during the era of the Two Trees, absorbing the raw, divine light of creation. This exposure permanently attuned his spirit to the unseen world, allowing him to exist fully in both realms at once. While a typical warrior might strike at a ringwraith's physical cloak, Glorfindel's very presence strikes at their spiritual essence. This is why, as Frodo's vision begins to fail near the Ford of Bruinen, he sees Glorfindel not as a golden-haired traveler, but as a figure of white fire, a blazing beacon of sanctity that the darkness of the ringwraiths simply cannot extinguish. This spiritual radiance is the primary reason the ringwraiths, who are masters of psychological terror, felt genuine fear when confronting him. In the unseen world, where the Nazgûl are most powerful, Glorfindel is even more formidable. He's a piece of the ancient West walking in the fallen East. Tolkien uses this contrast to show that true power in his legendarium is not found in physical weapons, but in the purity and weight of one's soul. Glorfindel shines because his spirit has been tempered by the light of the gods and the fire of resurrection, making him a spiritual nuclear deterrent that keeps the shadows of Mordor at bay through the sheer authority of his being. Why the Nazgûl refused to face him. The fear the Nazgûl felt toward Glorfindel was not the primal fear of a soldier facing a superior blade, but the ontological terror of a shadow facing a sun it cannot eclipse. The ringwraiths are creatures of fear and dread. Their greatest weapon is the Black Breath, a psychological despair that shatters the will of mortal men. However, this weapon is useless against Glorfindel. Having died and been re-embodied by the Valar, Glorfindel's spirit had been enhanced to a degree that he no longer possessed the capacity for mortal fear. When he pursued the Nine toward the ford of Bruinen, he was not merely hunting them, he was exerting a spiritual authority that caused the environment of the unseen world to become hostile to them. Tolkien makes it clear that the Nazgûl are sensitive to presence. In the text, as Glorfindel approaches, the ringwraiths do not charge, they give way. This hesitation stems from their recognition of Glorfindel's status as a high elf of the First Age. To the Witch King, Glorfindel was a living memory of the ancient wars that nearly destroyed their master, Sauron. The Nazgûl are sustained by the corruptive power of the One Ring, but Glorfindel is sustained by the pure light of the Blessed Realm. Because he exists simultaneously in the unseen world as a pillar of white fire, the Nazgûl are blinded by his proximity. To stay and fight him would be to risk a direct spiritual confrontation that could unhouse their spirits and send them shrieking back to Mordor. This dynamic of hesitation reached its climax at the ford of Bruinen. While the movies show the Nazgûl boldly entering the water to chase Arwen, the book describes a much more cautious retreat. They were trapped between the fire of Glorfindel behind them and the water of Elrond before them. The Witch King only entered the river out of a desperate attempt to reach the ring before the flood arrived, but he did so while constantly looking back at the golden-haired lord. This hesitation proved that Glorfindel was the ultimate deterrent. His presence alone was enough to disrupt the coordination of the Nine and provide the critical seconds needed for Frodo to reach safety. The moment the ring failed, the moment Frodo Baggins approaches the ford of Bruinen, his perception of reality is fracturing under the influence of the Morgul wound. In the seen world, he is a dying hobbit on a white horse, but in the unseen world, he is being pulled into a realm of shadows and ghosts. It is at this precise threshold of death that the veil is lifted, allowing Frodo to witness the true unshielded nature of Glorfindel. While his companions see an elf lord in a golden tunic, Frodo perceives a figure of white fire, a radiant being whose spirit burns with a luminescence that outshines the midday sun. This is the moment Tolkien confirms that Glorfindel is not merely a resident of Middle-earth, but a transplant from a higher plane of existence. This white fire is the physical manifestation of Glorfindel's Feia, soul, shining through his Hroa, body. Because Glorfindel had been purified during his time in the halls of Mandos and re-embodied by the Valar, his spirit possessed a potency that surpassed almost any other living being in the Third Age. For Frodo, seeing this form was both terrifying and comforting. It provided a beacon of absolute sanctity in a world that was rapidly turning into a dark, cold nightmare. This vision serves as a narrative pivot, shifting the story from a grounded travelogue into a high mythic epic, reminding the reader that there are ancient powers in the West capable of defying the darkness of Mordor on a fundamental atomic level. The significance of this vision at the ford cannot be overstated, as it explains why the Nazgûl were so desperate to cross the water before Glorfindel reached them. To the Nazgûl, this white fire was not just a light, but a searing heat that threatened their very existence. As Frodo looked back from the far bank, he saw the shadows of the Nine withered and small against the towering radiance of the Elf Lord. This visual contrast defines the spiritual stakes of the entire legendarium. The darkness of the ring is a hollow void, but the light of the Eldar, personified here by Glorfindel, is a substantial, overwhelming reality that the shadow can never truly overcome, even in its moment of apparent triumph. The prophecy that doomed the Witch King. Centuries before the events of The Lord of the Rings, Glorfindel stood upon the battlefields of Arthedain and uttered the words that would become the Witch King's undoing. During the Battle of Fornost, as the Witch King's forces crumbled, the Shadow Lord attempted a psychological retreat, mocking the King of Gondor. It was Glorfindel who rode forward, his mere presence forcing the wraith to vanish into the night. When the human king sought to pursue the fleeing evil, Glorfindel held him back with a chillingly accurate foresight. He prophesied, "Do not pursue him. He will not return to this land. Far off yet is his doom, and not by the hand of man will he fall." This was not a mere guess. It was a decree from a being who had walked the halls of fate itself. For the next 1,000 years, this prophecy acted as both a shield and a snare for the Witch King. In his arrogance, the leader of the Nazgûl interpreted man in the literal, biological sense, believing himself immune to any warrior on the battlefield. He grew overconfident, assuming since no man could kill him, he was essentially a god among mortals. However, Glorfindel, possessing the gift of Osinwë, thought communication, and the foresight of the Eldar, was using the word man in its gendered sense. He saw a future that the Witch King could not, a future where the courage of a woman of Rohan and the unexpected blade of a hobbit would exploit the loophole in his immortality. The weight of this prophecy is the hidden engine behind the Witch King's behavior at the ford of Bruinen. When he looks across the water at the figure of white fire, he isn't just seeing a powerful elf, he is seeing the prophet who predicted his eventual death. This history adds a layer of personal vendetta and deep-seated dread to their encounter. Glorfindel's words didn't just predict the future, they defined the limits of the Witch King's power. By the time Éowyn reveals herself on the Pelennor fields, she is simply the final hammer blow to a fate that Glorfindel had sealed ages prior in the cold mists of the north. The elf who killed a Balrog and died. To understand why Glorfindel is granted such authority in the Third Age, we must travel back over 6,000 years to the First Age and the fall of the hidden city of Gondolin. As the last great elven stronghold crumbled under the onslaught of Morgoth's dragons and orcs, a small group of refugees fled through the treacherous mountain pass of Cirith Thorenath. Their escape was suddenly cut off by a Balrog, a primordial demon of fire and shadow. In this moment of absolute crisis, Glorfindel, the lord of the House of the Golden Flower, stepped forward. He did not fight for glory or territory. He fought to protect the future of his race, specifically the young child Eärendil, whose descendants would eventually include both Elrond and Aragorn. The duel that followed remains one of the most legendary feats in the history of Middle-earth. On a narrow precipice thousands of feet above the jagged rocks, Glorfindel engaged the Spirit of Shadow. Despite his exhaustion from the siege of the city, he hewed the Balrog's iron helm and eventually drove his blade into the demon's belly. However, as the Balrog plummeted into the abyss, it reached out and seized Glorfindel by his long golden hair, dragging the elf lord down to his death. This was a catastrophe, a sudden, horrific turn that nonetheless allowed for the salvation of the refugees. Glorfindel's body was later recovered by Thorondor, the king of eagles, and buried beneath a mound of stones, where, miraculously, yellow flowers grew despite the barren mountain air. This sacrifice is the foundation of Glorfindel's character. In Tolkien's world, death is the ultimate test of the soul, and Glorfindel's willingness to face a creature of ancient night to save others transformed his spirit. He was no longer just an elven lord, he became a symbol of selfless resistance against the darkness. This event set the stage for his unprecedented return as the Valar, the gods, watched from the west and determined that such a noble spirit deserved a destiny far beyond the silent halls of Mandos. Without the fall at Gondolin, the white fire seen by Frodo at the ford of Bruinen would never have existed. The only elf sent back by the gods. When Glorfindel fell into the abyss with the Balrog, his story did not end. It merely transitioned into the halls of Mandos, the purgatorial waiting rooms of the Valar in the Blessed Realm. Under normal circumstances, elves who die in Middle-earth remain in these halls for ages, reflecting on their lives and the sorrows of their past. However, because Glorfindel's sacrifice was so pivotal, saving the ancestors of the line of kings, and his spirit was so free of the kinslaying stains that plagued other Noldor, he underwent a rapid and divine re-embodiment. The Valar did not just give him his body back, they enhanced him, purifying his spirit of the weariness of the world and infusing him with a potency that blurred the line between elf and angel. This resurrection turned Glorfindel into a unique metaphysical entity. Tolkien's letters explain that by the time he was sent back to Middle-earth, likely around the year 1600 of the Second Age, he had become an initiate of the Maiar. He lived among the gods and was trained in their light. When he finally stepped back onto the shores of Middle-earth, he was no longer a refugee of the First Age, but an ambassador of the West. His return was a tactical move by the Valar to bolster the defenses of the Elves against the rising shadow of Sauron. This is why his presence is so much heavier than other elves. He is the only being in history to have died a hero, stood before the gods in judgment, and been granted a second life specifically to serve as a guardian. The strength Glorfindel gained from this return was not just physical, but pneumatic. He possessed a spiritual authority that acted as a direct counter to the corruption of the Rings of Power. While other elven lords like Elrond or Galadriel relied on their rings, Vilya and Nenya, to preserve their realms, Glorfindel's power was innate, a gift of the Valar that could not be taken away or diminished by the fading of the world. He returned stronger because he had conquered the fear of death, making him the only warrior in Rivendell that Sauron's greatest servants truly feared to face in open combat. The elf who nearly became an angel. In the complex spiritual hierarchy of Tolkien's world, there is a clear distinction between the Eldar, the elves, and the Maiar, angelic spirits like Gandalf, Melian, and Sauron. However, Glorfindel occupies a unique liminal space that defies these standard categories. Tolkien explicitly stated in his later essays that by the time of his return to Middle-earth, Glorfindel's power had been so augmented by the Valar that he had become almost as one of the Maiar. This was not just a promotion in rank, but a fundamental change in his spiritual voltage. While other elves were bound by the natural laws of Middle-earth, Glorfindel operated with a divine mandate, possessing a soul that had been divinely infused with the same holy light that the wizards would later bring to the continent. This elevation made Glorfindel the ultimate hidden weapon of the Free Peoples. He did not possess the wizardry of Saruman or the elemental mastery of Gandalf, but he possessed a spiritual resistance that was virtually impenetrable. In Tolkien's philosophy, power is often measured by the ability to remain uncorrupted. Because Glorfindel had been sanctified in the Blessed Realm, the psychological shadows cast by Sauron simply slid off him. This Maya-like stature allowed him to walk through the most cursed lands of Eriador without his spirit dimming, acting as a living anchor for the light of the West in a world that was rapidly falling into the great fading. The decision to elevate Glorfindel to this near-angelic status was Tolkien's way of showing that the struggle against Sauron required more than just mortal effort. It required a bridge between the divine and the mundane. By making Glorfindel almost a Maya, Tolkien provided Rivendell with a guardian who could face the supernatural terrors of the Third Age on equal footing. He was the only elf who could stand at a council with Gandalf and Elrond, not just as a peer of blood, but as a peer of spirit, representing the raw, unyielding power of the First Age that had survived, transformed, and strengthened into the dawn of the Age of Men. The warrior too powerful for the Fellowship. After the Council of Elrond, a natural question arises. Why was the most powerful warrior in Rivendell left behind, while a gardener and a young hobbit took his place? The answer lies in the fundamental nature of the quest. The mission to destroy the One Ring was not a war of conquest, it was a mission of stealth and humility. Elrond and Gandalf understood that the ring thrived on greatness. Beings of high spiritual stature, like Glorfindel, are inherently visible of Sauron. To send Glorfindel would have been like trying to smuggle a sun into a dark room. His presence in the unseen world would have acted as a lighthouse, signaling the ring's movement to the Nazgûl and the Dark Lord long before they reached the borders of Mordor. Furthermore, the ring preys upon the noble intentions of the powerful. Because Glorfindel was almost a Maya, the temptation of the ring would have been exponentially more dangerous for him than for Frodo. Had he claimed it, he would not have become a petty criminal. He would have become a White Lord, a tyrant of light, who would have sought to fix the world through absolute, unyielding order. Tolkien's world-building suggests that the only way to defeat the will to power is through the will to sacrifice. Glorfindel's role was to be the shield that allowed the Fellowship to start their journey, not the sword that finished it. By staying behind, he performed the ultimate act of restraint, acknowledging that his era of high heroism had to give way to the small hands that move the wheels of the world. Finally, there was the pragmatic defense of the North to consider. While the Fellowship moved south, Rivendell remained a primary target for the forces of the Misty Mountains and the remnants of Angmar. By remaining in the Hidden Valley, Glorfindel acted as a strategic deterrent. His presence ensured that while Elrond used the ring Vilya to preserve the beauty of the valley, there was a military commander capable of repelling any supernatural threat that might attempt to sack the sanctuary. Glorfindel was too bright for a secret mission, but he was exactly the right kind of light to keep the darkness from closing in on the last homely house while the fate of the world was decided in the fires of Mount Doom. The one being protecting Rivendell. While the Fellowship of the Ring trekked through the snowy passes of Carithros and the lightless depths of Moria, Glorfindel remained behind as the invisible wall protecting the north. His role during the War of the Ring was one of strategic defense and active containment. Rivendell was not merely a museum of elven history, it was a high-value military target located dangerously close to the orc-infested Misty Mountains and the ruins of Angmar. Without Glorfindel and the sons of Elrond patrolling the borders, the last homely house would have been besieged within weeks. He acted as a living deterrent, his spiritual radiance creating a zone of exclusion that kept the lesser shadows of Sauron from encroaching upon Elrond's sanctuary while the master of the house was occupied with the war's logistics. Tolkien implies that the war in the north was a series of skirmishes and spiritual standoffs that never made it into the main narrative of the Red Book. As the Nazgûl were summoned south to Mordor and Osgiliath, the vacuum of power in Eriador was filled by orcs, trolls, and evil men. Glorfindel led the remaining elven riders in a silent campaign to keep the roads clear and the borders of the Shire and Rivendell secure. This quiet war was essential. If the North had fallen, there would have been no kingdom for Aragorn to return to and no Shire for the hobbits to reclaim. Glorfindel was the commander of this shadow front, ensuring that while the eyes of the Dark Lord were fixed on Gondor, the back door to the west remained bolted shut. The tragedy of Glorfindel's final years in Middle-earth was the knowledge of his own impending fading. He knew that if the ring were destroyed, the power of the three rings would fail, and the timeless beauty of Rivendell, the very thing he spent the Third Age guarding, would finally succumb to the march of time. Yet he performed his duties with the same joy Frodo noted at their first meeting. He represents the selfless guardian who protects a world he knows he must eventually leave. When the war was won and the Fourth Age dawned, Glorfindel's long watch finally ended, and he prepared to lead one of the last great ships from the Grey Havens, returning to the West not as a refugee, but as a soldier who had fulfilled every vow he ever made to the gods and his kin. Why Glorfindel never sought power. In the philosophy of J.R.R. Tolkien, the ultimate test of character is not how one wields power to conquer others, but how one restrains power to preserve life. Glorfindel is the personification of this strength through restraint. As a being who had defeated a Balrog and been returned to Middle-earth with the spiritual potency of an angel, he possessed the raw capacity to set himself up as a warlord or a king. He could have easily commanded legions or used his white fire to dominate the wills of lesser beings. Instead, he chose the path of a subordinate, serving the half-elven lord Elrond and acting as a scout and a guardian. This humility is what made him truly Maya-like, echoing the nature of Gandalf, who refused to meet Sauron's force with his own force, choosing instead to kindle hope in others. This lack of ambition is precisely why Glorfindel was so dangerous to the Dark Lord. Sauron's entire worldview was built on the assumption that anyone with power would inevitably seek to use it for domination. He could not comprehend a being like Glorfindel, someone who possessed ancient, world-shaking power but used it only to defend a small valley or to escort 4 frightened hobbits through the wilderness. By refusing to seek the spotlight or claim the ring, Glorfindel became invisible to the strategic mind of Mordor. His strength was a passive shield. He existed to ensure that the light of the West did not go out, rather than trying to forcibly extinguish the darkness of the East. In the final assessment, Glorfindel's greatness lies in his fading. Like the other High Elves, they understood that the Third Age was a twilight period, where the old powers had to step back to make room for the dominion of men. For a First Age hero of his stature to spend his final centuries in Middle-earth patrolling borders and sitting quietly at councils is a supreme act of cosmic patience. He didn't seek to win Middle-earth, he sought to save it, even knowing that his reward would be his own departure into the West. He proved that the highest form of power is the strength to step aside, ensuring that the victory over Sauron would belong to the humble, while he remained the silent, radiant guardian who made that victory possible. The end of Glorfindel's journey in Middle-earth serves as the ultimate resolution to the theme of restraint that defined his second life. After the One Ring was unmade and the shadow of Sauron dissipated, the Great War did not end with Glorfindel receiving a crown or a monument. Instead, it ended with a quiet, bittersweet fading. As a high elf whose power was tied to the ancient light of the West, the victory of the Third Age meant that his time on the mortal shores was officially over. He did not linger to be worshipped as a god-king by the men of the Fourth Age. Instead, he prepared for the final transition, recognizing that the magic of the world was departing to make room for the history of men. In the year 3021 of the Third Age, Glorfindel traveled to the Grey Havens, Mitholond, alongside Elrond, Galadriel, Gandalf, and the Ring-Bearers. This final voyage was not a retreat of the defeated, but a quiet victory. For Glorfindel, sailing into the West was a return to the home he had been sent from centuries earlier on a divine mission. He had fulfilled every prophecy, defended every border, and sacrificed his own prominence to ensure that a smaller, humbler world could survive. His story ends not in the deafening roar of battle, but in the soft lapping of waves against the hull of a white ship, signaling that the Guardian's watch had finally reached its conclusion. The legacy of the golden-haired lord is found in the survival of everything he touched. He saved Arendelle in the First Age, which allowed for the birth of the kings. He saved Frodo in the Third Age, which allowed for the destruction of the ring. He remains the most successful unseen hero in Tolkien's legendarium, a being of immense, blinding light who was content to be remembered by history as a mere traveler on a white horse. By choosing quiet victory over loud glory, Glorfindel proved that the most enduring heroes are not those who conquer the world, but those who protect its potential and then have the grace to let it go. The lesson of the golden flower. Glorfindel represents the deep magic of Tolkien's world. He is the bridge between the high angelic myths of the beginning and the grounded human struggles of the end. By understanding his story, we see that Middle-earth was never just about a ring. It was about the preservation of light in a world prone to shadow. Glorfindel was that light personified, a hero who died for the future, lived for the present, and sailed into the past.